You're listening to the Boomtime Digital Marketing Podcast. For over 50 episodes, Boomtime has been the professional source for marketing information and inspiration. For more articles and episodes, visit us at boomtime.com and be sure to subscribe to the Digital Marketing Podcast on your iPhone or Android device to listen on the go. Now, here's your host, JP Clement.
So this is the first of our success story podcast. I'm JP Clement, the CEO of Boomtime, and this is Nick Martinez, one of our key strategists at Boomtime. And I think today we're going to talk about one of our big success stories with a client for whom we're doing what we call our Connect package campaigns, which includes a lot of LinkedIn lead generation and marketing.
Absolutely.
Right? Yep. And so I think what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this client, but just wanted to give our audience a little bit of context. We're going to be doing a series of these success stories, starting with Advertek and Nick, but you might see different people, and definitely we'll hear about different types of companies from our very expert Boomtime crew. So Nick, tell us a little bit more about Advertek, and then I'll ask you some more questions about what you did for them and how it worked.
Sure. Yeah. Advertek is one of my clients. They're a printing company out of Canada. They came to us hoping to utilize our LinkedIn connection campaign package to build up strategically their connection base for their co-CEO. His name is Joe. And so Joe I think that's a really interesting portion of this is many clients come to us for LinkedIn help and they're already on LinkedIn, but they come to us because they need their profile optimized. They need help with Sales Navigator search queries and just overall strategic guidance and direction to hone in on specific personas that they would like to connect with.
Yeah. And if I remember correctly, Advertek also needed help with an integration into a CRM system, right?
Absolutely, yeah. They utilize Pipedrive in this case, and so their marketing director, Carissa, was going to oversee this campaign. So we would be augmenting, their expertise, and then she would be handing off her marketing qualified leads to the sales team. So this was a really awesome activity and opportunity for them to develop leads and prospects, especially in a new business environment that no one had ever been through before. So and enter Boomtime.
Yeah, if I recall, that was quite the selling point was that, they didn't even have a CRM, I think, before we started with them.
Right.
And we had to recommend them as a CRM, which we're Pipedrive users, so we also listen a lot about Pipedrive. And building that integration was definitely a big kind of a sea change for those guys, right?
Absolutely. And I think in terms of utilizing our expertise with a client collaboration, because they had never used a CRM, this was a way to formalize from a marketing perspective, prospects coming in and being able to track everyone and have metrics assigned to the activity. So again, for a marketing director to prove that this activity is working and then exceeding expectations, it's all outlined with metrics and becomes very, very black and white and no gray area, which is what sometimes happens with marketing success and trying to fight for what's working.
Yeah, well, yes, we definitely like to use those analytics to prove the value of what we do and make sure there is no gray areas, right? I mean, If you set the parameters and you set the campaigns correctly, then you'll be able to tell whether it's working or not, and there is actual factual numbers there to prove the value of what we do. So can you summarize quickly, like, how well it worked? I mean, this is obviously a success story, so I'd like to hear a little bit, what got out there, and then we'll dive into the details and the tips and hints and how-tos and best practices.
Absolutely. And so Advertek has been working with us since January of 2021. So we're just now finishing up our 6th month of LinkedIn activity. So the best part is that the success story that it's live on the website is actually a work in progress. So there's still ongoing campaigns and new angles for us to truly pivot into. So the basics were that we utilized the initial phase of the campaign to grow Joe's strategic connection base on LinkedIn. And from there, we honed in on personas within the printing industry that he thought matched their top types of customers and clients. And so in many cases, these were marketing directors that needed printing services. And then we also utilized Sales Navigator to create a lead list based on exact handpicked people that Joe wanted to connect with and basically get in front of. And so the analogy was, we can't go to trade shows anymore, and we can't blindly, meet people, hand out a business card, and then go back to your office and you're physically counting every business card. So this was a way to actually determine who the audience was and set it up as a numbers game, so that everyone you were speaking to was a highly sought after potential prospect, which was super exciting. And then I think the best part was Carissa developed a really nice cadence to see the actual conversations that were happening in real time on Joe's behalf within LinkedIn. And so she was able to apply the appropriate follow-up message, nurture those conversations, and then we had a labeling system in place to label them from a hot to cold level for prospects, and then shoot them over to their CRM. So,
yeah, and do you have some hard numbers to put on this success?
I do, yeah. So Advertek was really interesting because they had a very precise understanding of what a lifetime value was for our clients. So their lifetime value was just over $60,000. I believe we conservatively figured it at $65,000. And so through the first roughly 4.5 months of the campaigns that were running, they developed 63 marketing qualified leads that were passed over to their sales team. And the total lead value was just over $900,000.
Wow, that's outstanding.
Yeah, it was super exciting because, from the first couple weeks, we knew that Joe's connection rate was higher than normal. Typically, like a 25% connection rate is very successful. Joe was hovering between 35 and 45% for his initial connection. So it spoke well as to how his profile was optimized. So as an introduction, a digital introduction, there was a automatic message that was set up that spoke well. It was not confrontational. He's not selling anything. He's just trying to provide value and connect. And then if you were to look at his actual LinkedIn profile, it's very nicely branded. He is who he says he is. And you can see that, as a co-CEO in this industry, he is a person worth knowing. And so that really knocks down an initial barrier to entry just to get your foot in the door.
Yeah, it seemed like it worked really well. But yeah, and I think one thing that people tend to forget when they do marketing on LinkedIn is that it's a social network and it connects people to other people, not companies to companies, right? And so you need to have a level of personability, if that's a word. You need to be able to communicate with people one-on-one during the connection process and make sure they understand you're a person, not a company hard selling them. And I think this approach of having a very, very soft sell, almost no sell at all, but just trying to create those connections in a very soft way and a non-threatening way and non-salesy way is what really makes it work. And I'm glad you use those best practices for the campaign. It seemed like it worked very well.
Yeah, totally agree. And I would say the thing that we added on to Joe's account or his profile was, we had him talk about himself. So we were able to really distill his professional experience, beef up the About Me page. We had branded assets that we added, for banner images, an updated headshot. So all of those small updates and upgrades, actually LinkedIn provides an all-star credential to your account. And so Joe was labeled as an all-star. And so just looking at his profile, you can see everything is there. And you get a really good, holistic view of who he is and, his place in the industry. So you're talking to a major decision maker, and that's really where the magic starts to happen.
Yeah, it definitely helps. So talk to me a little bit more about, it sounds like you did a lot of work with Joe and Carissa on really setting up the personas that he was going after on LinkedIn very precisely.
Sure.
And then, so talk to me a little bit about that, and also how you translated those personas into Sales Navigator searches.
Yeah,
because that's a critical part of, obviously, being able to target and to be very specific about your targeting, and it therefore helps do really good searches. And if you do good searches, you have a better chance of connecting on top of that.
Exactly. Yeah. So So Joe is awesome in that regard, because during the initial client intake, we have some basic questions that have them outline their when we're talking about goals at the onset of a campaign, we outline the persona. Who do you want to speak to? Who is the ideal candidate to have a meeting with? And where have you had success in a non-LinkedIn arena before? And so by asking these questions, and then them having a really good understanding of who their top not just clients are, but who the clients they'd like to have are. Those are not always the same thing. Sure. And they knew exactly who they wanted to speak to. And so the fact that Joe and Carissa were so unified and leaned on their experience was super helpful. And so by understanding who that person was, we were able to actually find an exact person that he found and said, this is the type of person I want to speak to. And so we were able to build a persona off of those, search filters essentially. And so we went into Sales Navigator, and I gave them a training session, and we still do training sessions as ongoing education, basically, where we created that search navigation, the Search Navigator search query, and really, like, this was the proof of concept. This is who we want to speak to. Great, let's try it, phase one. And then the best part about it, I like to think of the phase one of the campaign as the giving tree, because if you set it up correctly, it can run for anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks, and it keeps identifying very good matches based on the initial criteria, because your connection base is growing strategically. So it just keeps feeding you really good people, and then subsequent searches are even more successful based off of that.
That's great. But you've run more than just that original search for Joe, right?
Correct.
You've evolved into more refined, more specific, maybe vertical driven type of searches?
Yeah, absolutely. So within the industry, they have different types of prospects. And so there are searches geared to each of those personas. And then we also launched various campaigns based off of individual manually picked lead lists that Joe and Carissa created. Okay. So within Sales Navigator, Carissa actually created a lead list of 500 people. You can go up to 1,000 people. And we imported that list and sent out connection requests to each of those people. And so in many cases, each campaign had slightly differentiated messaging. So creating that messaging framework is the other sweet science aspect of it, to make sure you're talking to them about something relevant, offering a value proposition, hopefully differentiating yourself, but then doing it in a way that's it's very it's a soft sell and very human.
And you use kind of, if I recall correctly, you use kind of a multiple message setup, right? Where it's not just, hey, connect with me. It's way more than that. You start to engage people on a pretty personal level, right?
Absolutely. So so we introduced Joe. He basically says, I've identified you as someone I'd really like to have a conversation with because we are in the same industry together. And then a follow-up message, if they don't respond, maybe speaks to Advertek, which is the company Joe is co-CEO of. And it talks about maybe a value proposition and sometimes a link to learn more. So they have videos on their website that we link to. They had printing catalogs. There's so many different assets that we were able to tap into to make sure that we were letting people discover them at their own pace.
Great. And so once you connected them and started having Joe or Joe's profile exchange messages with these prospects, then what are the next steps, and how does our Sales Connector tool help Joe and Carissa kind of nurture these leads, basically?
Yeah, great question. So the number one way is Carissa then took over the day-to-day operations of the campaign, because she logged into the platform, and at a dashboard level, it shows all of the conversations that are occurring. And so I helped Carissa by providing a starter document that had response messages that would help to nurture a conversation and move them forward to either pre-qualify them as an actual marketing lead or disqualify them. And, it's basically a nice to know you, thanks for connecting. Let me know how I can be of service in the future. And so Carissa was really good at figuring out which types of response messages worked and then refining the messaging going forward. So there were several iterations of the campaign, and even to this day, as she gets ideas or we have ideas based on best practices, we'll initiate those new conversations and see how they perform.
Yeah. And did you use the can message tool that so you can create those series of messages like that, and then just at the push of a button send the right message to the right person?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's exactly what we did. Yeah. And really that was one of the main things that Carissa really enjoyed was how easy it was to use the platform and figure out what's working and make adjustments in real time.
Yeah. And you said you color-coded them, right? Too?
Correct.
Those
yes.
Messages or those leads, right? Those
yes.
Prospects, yeah.
So each prospect has a conversation, and so it gives context into what's being said. And so we had a labeling system based from hot to cold to signify which stage the conversation was at. And so once they were at a yellow stage, which in this case was a follow-up, they were eligible to be sent over to their CRM for the sales team to take them on. And so maybe in this case, follow-up was sales team calling to check on them or have a meeting, or maybe even kick it old school and mail a catalog to their office along with maybe a handwritten note or something.
Great. Okay. So how did you handle? I'm curious because to me, at least as someone who does kind of the same things that Joe does, how did you handle the handoff from Joe on LinkedIn to the Salesforce, and not necessarily in the technology, but how did you handle that, or tell Carissa to handle it in terms of making that transition from being handed off as a potential client from the CEO of the company to just a salesperson, basically?
Sure. Yeah. Great question. So we had a conversation and several conversations to understand their internal protocol for how their sales team took leads and what their existing pipelines looked like.
Okay.
And then communicated why LinkedIn was just as valid or maybe even more important than their other pipelines. And so we had the benefit of the doubt because they couldn't go to trade shows. They couldn't just knock on a door and take donuts in to talk to somebody. So the numbers spoke for themselves really quickly. And because of that, Carissa and Joe were the internal champions that were utilized to tell the team, hey, these prospects are fantastic.
Yeah.
They already know who Joe is, and they're expecting the follow-up. So in this case, we had some response messages that were planned out that said, hey, my director of sales, Rob, will be calling you and reaching out, or some way to hand off in a digital realm before the actual phone call came in.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah, that's a good, because that's a kind of a sensitive time, right? Where you said, okay, this is turning from an MQL into an SQL, right? And about that transition, especially when you've been in front of the CEO, can be a little bit tricky. So I'm glad that you had a whole setup for that. That's great.
Yeah, and I would say that the platform was super helpful in that regard too, because when you send over the prospect to their CRM, it includes the most recent conversation points so that there's context for it, but also we ended up training their head of sales to use the platform so that he could look in and see stuff as well and do his homework and find intel. So overall, the client was super willing to learn, but then they ended up getting more stakeholders involved. So everyone had a really holistic understanding of what was happening.
Which is definitely a huge part of why it's successful, right?
For sure.
You get all the stakeholders really bought into that process and that system. It makes a huge difference.
I totally agree.
Tell me a little bit more about this integration. So we're passing on not just the name and an email and a phone number and stuff like that into the CRM, but also actual notes and conversations that happen within the Sales Connector platform. And all that gets passed on at the push of a button, right, to the CRM system, to the Pipedrive in this case?
That's exactly it. Yeah, all of the contact info as outlined on the person's LinkedIn profile. The 3 most recent communication exchanges. And then also what I thought was cool, and this is more of an old school sales tactic, is we were able to export a list of all of the conversations so that the client actually had a spreadsheet showing, full contact list, companies, people, and it had it all there, and they could kind of verify against the CRM and see, where are opportunities and, create their own hierarchy for how they wanted to reach out.
That's great. There is something you mentioned that I want, I think, to get back to, because it sounds like you you're not sitting still, right, with this campaign. And I think with other campaigns that we do, but it sounds like you're constantly trying to improve, to refine, to test new things, right? And that's kind to me, it sounds like it's, I think it's an important point to tell the people who may be listening that, like everything else in digital world, if you sit still, you're falling behind, right?
Sure.
So can you talk a little bit more about actually how you do that and why you do it and what happens there?
Yeah, great question again. So I feel like everything is an iteration, everything can be improved upon, and then we're always up to trying new ideas. So even if they don't work, as long as there's a solid rationale, it's defensible to say like, yeah, it was worth trying. So Chris and Joe are always game to try out ideas, which is really cool and helpful. And so if I notice a best practice working for another client, I'll normally say, hey, this is what someone else is doing. Can we try a version for you? And so on top of just the minor tinkering, we're always looking at, okay, which version of the campaign worked well? Who is the next person that you want to speak to and why? And should the messaging be different? And should, so we have all of these pre-qualifying questions for the campaign creation that helps to really create new inflection points for them to really deliver on those goals that they set out.
Yeah, great. I think important to note and to take note of because again, I mean things move very fast. So Casey, I mean, did you have any searches where you ran out of potential connections?
Yeah, that certainly always happens, and so when the runway ends, before we get to that point, we have the next plan to jump to the next campaign, and so in several instances we ran multiple campaigns concurrently. So in this case, like we would have lead list number 1, and then we would have a campaign phase that was going to a search query. So having 2 campaigns running in parallel was super helpful because there would be slightly different messaging and slightly different goals. And so as we learned and extinguished one campaign, it was simple to then understand where the next logical step would be. And so there's certainly a science to it, but it's definitely dictated by solid client feedback because they're so empowered and they're in the platform and they're part of the success. In fact, they're the main driver. So it becomes a really fun collaborative environment for us.
Great. So there's one other thing that I wanted to touch upon that I'm kind of forgetting actually. I know we're going to get to the analytics part at some point, but there was something else that I wanted to talk about because I thought it was important, which is the difference between, help me understand that a little bit because I know you're the expert. I know the system pretty well, but not quite as well as you do. And especially because you mentioned that Carissa for Advertek created leads list.
Correct.
Did she create those inside of Sales Navigator, or was it an external list that she imported into Sales Navigator?
Great question. So actually kind of a combination of both. She created the lead list within Sales Nav, but it was because they had intel within the company as to which companies they wanted to reach out to, which people that were maybe existing leads that they had. And then part of what makes Sales Navigator, kind of the secret sauce is that if you know which company you want to look for, you can find other decision makers that are on LinkedIn from that company. So in many cases, she'd find 5 or 6 people from a key account that they've been chasing and said, well, let's talk to all of them, not just one of them. And that's how we built them out.
So interesting. So a little bit, they almost were doing account-based marketing, right?
Correct.
ABM. Wow, interesting. Which is pretty kind of sophisticated. I mean, if you think that, especially for people who didn't even have a CRM before they started.
Right. Yeah. And I talked about like a logical progression of each next step that they went to. And as they found out the functionality and what was available, they kept pushing and said, can we try this? What about this? And to their credit, they were always savvy enough to figure out the next place to get value from.
Yeah. So it sounds like having a success story like this, it's not just about a great digital marketing company and great LinkedIn marketers like you, but it's also having a client that's willing to listen, that's willing to learn, that's willing to really get engaged. And that's part of the secret sauce, right? I mean, that really helps.
Yeah, totally agree. It's certainly a teamwork atmosphere. They always come to the table with an idea, and I know when I have a weekly client meeting, I always have to have an idea or a value add myself. And so when we're trying to always make things better, if both sides are doing it, it's always best practice, secret sauce.
Great. So going back to lead lists versus searches, in your experience, and especially for Advertek, what worked best, and what are kind of best practices around that? Because the beauty of Sales Navigator is you do some really complicated, very, very refined searches. You have keywords and Boolean, what are they called? Things like and or not, and things like that.
Right.
So lead lists versus searches.
That's an awesome question. So the lead list was super valuable for them because it was replenishing a type of prospect pipeline. So again, they couldn't go to a trade show, they couldn't go to door to door. So it was aimed at hitting a very specific type of potential client, whereas a search query was being utilized to strategically grow Joe's connection base, so that future searches, like the viability was much better. But then also it allowed us to have slightly more open-ended communication that wasn't as like pinpoint or sharply focused. So for instance, there were lead lists that were to very specific types of people within the industry. So there was questions about budgets, there was questions about how we could get a foot in the door to give a proof of types of services, whereas to some of the broader searches, it was more so asking about pain points and seeing like where they could provide value. So slightly different approach. Both were very successful, but ideally the lead list was extra valuable because we were replenishing a pipeline.
Yeah, great. But lead lists require a little bit more involvement from the client, right? Obviously, as opposed to like start it, do the search, let it run, and then you're good.
Yeah, lead list was me assigning homework and then empowering the client, and if they really wanted to build it out, they would take that on. And
so kudos to Advertek for being great partners.
Absolutely. And because of our work doing that, I was able to outline that framework to other clients who adopted a similar philosophy. So I have many clients doing something like that.
Well, I mean, if you can generate almost $1 million worth of lead value for a client, I think that's worth their time and their investment in time and resources doing that kind of lead list development, right?
That's absolutely.
Yeah, great. So we could talk about this for hours, but I think let's get towards the kind of the end of the process. Almost, it's not the end of the campaign, but kind of a very important part of the process, which is the analytics. So how did you set it up? What did you do for Advertek? How did it work out?
Yeah, great question. So the key part of analytics for their statistics dashboard was entering the lead value. So I'm sorry, the lifetime value of the client. Being that this amount was roughly $65,000, each of the labels that we assigned to a conversation became a percentage of what the eventual conversion could become.
Okay.
And so it was a summation of all of those types of conversations. And so the dashboard offers a kind of a bird's eye view of overall performance, so that they could see, maybe the majority of conversations were in a friendly stage, and there was now it was incentivizing them to move them forward to a follow-up stage, because the value of a follow-up is so much greater than a friendly, and friendlies were roughly like a neutral positive stance. So it's maybe like, hey, Joe, great to meet you, looking forward to visiting. That's a neutral positive, but we need to push them further to pre-qualify them to see what exactly we can do. And so the dashboard within Sales Connector was extremely helpful because it showed in real time what that value was. And then Carissa could relay that information to the sales team to show them actual numbers, actual data, and then move stuff over to the CRM.
Yeah. And you mentioned something about the connection rate and the messaging rate. That's also part of the dashboard, right?
Exactly right. Yeah. So it'll show you total connection requests, how many accepted connections happened, what your connection rate was, and then the types of messaging replies you're getting. And so we have some, overall, I call them rules of thumb, if I can pluralize my thumbs, to show them where they should be, what's successful and what's very successful. So that helps to set up goals and expectations from the onset, and then when we're exceeding those goals, it's a really easy way to show value again.
Yeah. And do you think that Carissa, and that might be kind of a weird question that you didn't have an answer to, but how often do you think they looked at a dashboard between Joe and Carissa? Or
I think
is it like a frequent thing?
I'm positive Carissa looked at it every day.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Every day she probably spent maybe 15 minutes on it, just looking at it. So it was never out of hand. Whereas Joe probably looked at it on a weekly basis, and I know him and Carissa reviewed it, and then they had a weekly sales meeting where they would also talk about it as a team. So a few different ways to look at it, but it was Carissa doing the day-to-day management to make it go.
So it sounds like it's almost up to the client to, they can do whatever they want, but they can have very low involvement with the campaign. The campaign can run, just basically do most of that automatically, and they can just check whenever they want, move people from, Sales Connector to their CRM, but also they can get super granularly involved like Carissa did.
Absolutely. And I've actually seen a lot of success having a marketing director or marketing manager that I work with within the client's team, because the MQLs are directly assigned to them to prove how well they're doing their job. So it's in Carissa's best interest to prove how great this activity is performing so that her team reaps the benefits.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. Yeah, I mean, if you have a marketing director, great. Some of our clients don't, from what I know. Yeah,
right. So in that case, I have a more pronounced role, certainly at the beginning of the campaign, because I'm showing them how to do it and setting up expectations. And then from there, I always review them on a weekly basis. And so if I see something that needs like immediate attention, it's a simple email or call or a weekly check-in where we review action items for them.
Yeah. I just read an article just probably a couple months ago that said that an amazing stat. They're saying that if you can respond to a hot lead, right, what should be a really good lead, within 5 minutes, your probability of actually turning them into an actual client is like 15 times higher than if you respond within 24 hours, for instance.
Sure.
So so it's in our client's best interest to actually keep an eye on this, and themselves, and use this great dashboard to be able to identify those people we need to be answered to right away.
Exactly, and even to that point, something I talked to Joe about was that he could open the LinkedIn app on his phone, respond to something if he needed to, and Carissa would also see that response within the platform. So they were speaking to each other, the platform and LinkedIn instantaneously. So she would have the most up-to-date intel, even if he was, say, at dinner writing back to a prospect on his phone really quickly. She was aware of it, and they could move forward accordingly.
Yeah. Well, lots of best practices in this success story. I mean, it sounds like they're an amazing client that really took to this. So
absolutely,
under your great leadership and training,
they made me look good. That's for sure.
Okay, great. So let's wrap this up. So there is obviously, to me, there is a kind of a pretty obvious secret sauce here at play. But tell me what the main ingredients in your mind of the secret sauce are.
I think collaboration, and this I think is true of anybody, but when Joe and Carissa saw some positive results from the very beginning, they only got more excited to keep pushing it forward. So they were the main catalysts for continued success. And then we had a logical progression to go from one campaign to the next. So there was always a plan.
Yeah. But I would say to me, I would have, I agree with what you said, but I think there is more ingredients to the secret sauce. I think the way you set up the messaging, the actual content of the messaging, the frequency of the messaging, I think it's something that people don't probably think it's obvious and easy and whatever, but it's not. I think there is quite a bit of value there. Also in the fact that we're using a tool that has a lot of capabilities, but allows you to really easily nurture leads, sort through leads, do triage basically, leads and all of that, and keep track of all of that in a way that makes it really manageable, despite the fact that I'm sure some of your searches had probably 1,500, 2,000 different, search results, right? So that means a lot of stuff to go through,
right?
And that the tool that we use is actually making it super manageable, because it could be overwhelming, right? Or look overwhelming.
Right. Yeah, that's a great keyword, is it's making volume manageable and making it really scalable for a team. So it's not, going to a trade show or a convention and, all hands on deck. It was more so like, we can launch this, we can let it run for 2 weeks or for 2 months, and then we can always have the same best practices in place to make sure that we're qualifying and moving people forward.
Yeah, great. Well, Nick, that was great. Thank you for the great success story and answering all my questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hopefully, anybody who's listening got a lot of good secret saucy ingredients, tips, and ideas on how to make their LinkedIn campaigns better. And of course, they can always reach out to you or me, and we can demo Sales Connector and things like that.
I love to demo it. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Super. Great. Okay. Thanks again, Nick.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Boomtime Digital Marketing Podcast. For more episodes and to learn more about us, check us out at boomtime.com.